Welcome back to Let's Talk Politics. Before we dive into today's episode, let's catch you up on some of the latest headlines making news. In the first question period of the new session, Conservative interim leader Andrew Scheer threw some pointed shade at Prime Minister Mark Carney for failing to table a spring budget, joking that the so-called man with a plan seems more focused on planning his summer vacation than a fiscal strategy. Prime Minister Carney fired back, reminding the House that Pierre Poilievre's much-touted 100-day plan, referenced with a not-so-subtle jab as the former member for Carleton, also failed to mention any spring budget. Carney insisted his government will move immediately on legislation tied to nation-building projects and a more unified Canadian economy. But the drama doesn't stop there. Pipelines and middle-class tax cuts took center stage as the opposition pressed the government during question period. This came on the heels of some mixed messaging from former Environment Minister, now Culture Minister, Steven Guilbeault, who recently said Canada should focus on maximizing existing pipelines rather than building new ones. The comment likely added fuel to the fire, especially amid growing separatist sentiment in Alberta, where the oil and gas industry is central to the province's economy. Meanwhile, Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith says she's encouraged by Prime Minister Mark Carney's shift in tone on energy policy following Monday's First Ministers' meeting in Saskatoon. The gathering brought Prime Minister Carney and all 13 premiers together to talk fast-tracking nation-building infrastructure and dismantling internal trade barriers. Carney even hinted at real potential for a new oil pipeline. Premier Smith, who's been vocal about her demands, like repealing Bill C-69 and lifting the emissions cap, says discussions are ongoing. And speaking of internal trade, Ontario has now signed deals with 6 provinces, including Alberta and PEI, to break down interprovincial trade barriers and unlock free trade. Agreements with Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan are also in place, making this a major push to grow provincial economies amidst the backdrop of looming U.S. tariffs and a recession. To unpack what all of this means and give us a Western perspective, joining us again is Dan Arnold, Chief Strategy Officer at Pollara Strategic Insights. In this episode, we dive headfirst into the factors fueling Western alienation and Alberta separatism, what a referendum could look like, and what the data reveals about this growing sentiment. Quick heads up, this episode was recorded on May 18, 2025. So while some headlines may have changed since this conversation was recorded, the ideas and thoughts still remain relevant. So, let's talk politics with Dan Arnold. I want to lean into Danielle Smith's been a very vocal advocate about what's been happening with Western alienation and not feeling heard at the Fed level. And it's not just fringe voices amplifying these messages. We also have columnist Rick Bell and even Preston Manning have all suggested that another Liberal government is going to be pushing the West closer to secession. How much influence do you think these voices have on that public sentiment, in addition to all that noise that we're seeing on social media?
Yeah, I think people often do take their cues from political leaders. You'll see this sometimes in polling where, in the States, for example, which is very polarized, where Republicans are all for free trade and then Donald Trump says, I hate free trade. And suddenly Republicans are all against free trade. And you see the lines kind of cross there. And on many issues that happens where a party leader kind of puts a position down and then people sort of follow because that becomes, what I guess is good because the person I like says this, right? So if you have a lot of conservative leaders in Alberta, be they former leaders or current leaders, giving credence to this idea of separatism, I think support will probably grow from it. It probably won't grow to the point where it actually is winning a referendum, but it could grow from 20% to 30%. It may already have, based on some other polling that's out there. So yeah, I think that's very dangerous for people like Preston Manning to be talking about separatism, especially when it's, again, he's not really even making an argument about the benefits of an Alberta country. He's making more an argument of like, I'm upset because the country's not electing the party that I like. And there are lots of people who don't vote for the party that's in power, but that's our system, right? And I think it's always better to kind of work constructively with governments. A lot of premiers have been able to do that. Even Brad Wall signed a lot of agreements with Trudeau. I remember back in the first couple of years of the Trudeau administration around pensions and other things. So I think there are ways to approach this that are more constructive. And then you have the Preston Manning approach, which I think is a lot less constructive and is really just sort of riling people up. And yeah, I think it certainly will have an impact because people do take their cues from people that they see as leaders.
Yeah. And do you think, given what we've been seeing in the US, do you think there's a bit of a spillover of maybe some of the tactics of rallying up bases or beliefs when it comes to certain issues? Do you think that's being impacted more? And I really point to social media. I think seeing these influencers, the Joe Rogans, all these kind of people who are being a bit more politically involved and again, rallying that basis. Do you think that's spilling over here and that those mannerisms?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it's certainly, as we've talked about already, there's people are getting their media from different sources, and someone like a Joe Rogan is probably more influential than, or at least as influential as the Mike Wallace or like the nightly newscaster. So yeah, I think there is a right-wing media ecosystem in Canada. If you look at kind of the rebel media crowd and some of the spin-off publications there that do feed into a lot of these quasi-conspiracy theory stories. And I think that does create a bit of an echo chamber that can really give people a perspective that is very different from what they're getting from the mainstream media. So yeah, I think that kind of like right wing online echo chamber alternative media, whatever you want to call it, is fueling a lot of the things we're talking about here.
And as we're talking about these echo chambers earlier this week, an Alberta separatist group released the proposed referendum question on sovereignty from Canada, saying they plan to pressure Premier Danielle Smith for a vote as early as this year if they can gather enough support. And the question that they have proposed to the public is, I'm going to read it out here, quote, "Do you agree that the province shall become a sovereign country and cease to be a province of Canada?" End quote. What do you make of that wording? It feels to me very calculated, almost like it's designed to echo that right-wing rhetoric we've been seeing across social media and some alternative media platforms that we just mentioned. But, is that intentional framing in your view?
I don't know. I mean, to some extent, I actually would say it's not a unfair question. If you go look back to like the 95 referendum question in Quebec, it was like a 5 paragraph question about associations. I don't think they even mentioned the word independence one point in it there. So it was a very convoluted question to almost trick people into, thinking you could keep the benefits of Canada and be another country at the same time. Whereas this is pretty direct. Like if I was writing a polling question, I don't know if I read it that differently from what they said there. So I'll give them credit to that. And I did read an article though with the same group, and they were talking about like, well, we keep the Canadian pension and passports, and so I think they are still trying to have a bit of the cake and eat it too. A thing you often see from the Quebec separatist movement. I don't think they would necessarily have access to the Canadian dollar or Canadian passports. I found it quite funny that they were talking about keeping the Canada pension plan at a time when Danielle Smith is talking about an Alberta pension plan. So her Alberta pension plan is so unpopular, even the Alberta separatists still want to touch it, which I got a bit of a kick out of. But yeah, I think, look, as we get actually into an actual referendum, if we go down that road, some of these other questions are going to come into focus a bit more in terms of what this actually means. And I think, from a polling perspective now, it's easy to say, yeah, of course, I'd vote for separatism as just a bit of an FU to Ottawa. But if you actually sort of think this through in terms of the consequences and what being a landlocked country would mean. And I don't think that's going to help oil get to markets necessarily. So there's a few consequences that are easy to kind of gloss over on a poll as opposed to when you're actually voting in the ballot box. And if we get into a campaign, I think some of those things will come into a bit more focus.
All interesting points. And yeah, I think it's funny that there seems to be a bit of disconnect between maybe what the base wants of what this idea of sovereignty and separatism looks like versus what the leader's also proposing. There's even under Kenny been that push for an Alberta focused pension plan. There was a vote on that and it didn't go through. So it should be interesting to see how much of this is just striking while the iron's hot and a lot of people's anxieties and maybe frustrations at this point to what are the future implications of our decisions today? So all really interesting stuff. I want to focus a little bit more on polling. If you can share a little bit, like what does that look like when you are trying to select this data from whatever the issue that you're focusing on? Let's talk about separatism, for example. What kind of data or demographics, pinpoints, questions do you ask to start to collect that information and maybe make a theory based off of what people are responding to, whatever the issue is?
Yeah, let's take this issue around Alberta separatism as a bit of a case study, I guess, to talk about this. And yeah, like I think you'll see a lot of polls in the newspaper. They'll be just saying X percent of Albertans want to separate, which is very similar to what you see in an election campaign. You see horse race polls. But, for those polls, when you're doing it for a political party, you're asking a lot of other questions about leadership impressions and what's driving the vote and messages that could change that. And it would be a very similar situation here. So if I was doing polling for a group trying to keep Canada together, for example, like I'd be looking a lot more at what's driving those sentiments as opposed to just figuring out what the number is. Is it 20%, 30% who supports separatism? It's not as important as figuring out like why they are in that position and what could actually change those opinions, right? So you would be probably testing different messages around identity, independence, grievances, and arguments we just talked about again, like being landlocked and access to passports and things like that. And you'd be looking to see which of those messages actually change opinions and drive support up or down for independence as a result of those messages. You can, on an online survey, you can show people kind of an ad or a message and then test their opinion afterwards. And you can actually measure if it goes up or down as a result of that. So that's what I'd be looking to do at this stage. And you can do that in surveys. You can also sit people down in a focus group and kind of like, again, talk them through the issue and sort of understand better where they're coming from. Is this being driven by feelings of grievances? Is it just because there's a liberal in power? So these are all things you could do. You could also test, I guess, spokespeople that are trusted. Like, is what Preston Manning says influential to people? And if you're kind of putting together a Canada No campaign, like who's the spokesperson on that? Is it Naheed Nenshi? Is it Jason Kenney? Like, who are the people that you want to be talking? It might not be Mark Carney, who you want to be leading the pro-Canada side of this referendum if it gets there. So these are all things that you definitely would be testing behind the scenes, and maybe these aren't all things that come out for media polls, but just as when you're polling for political campaigns, there's a lot more research that goes into it, and it's usually to figure out like why people feel the way they do and what you can do to change their feelings.
Yeah, for sure. And I appreciate a little bit more of that breakdown because I think we always see these polling data and news and don't understand necessarily the behind the scenes of where does this actually come from? What are the questions? And we just kind of see that final product. And going back to Preston Manning, he went as far as to say during the campaign, a vote for Carney Liberals is basically a vote for the breakup of Canada. So really interesting to see that rhetoric out in the public sphere. And as we're talking about data, I'm also curious, like, have you seen the data collection space evolve over the last few years, whether it is in the political realm and people's responses and interactions with politicians and political news? Like, have you seen an evolution? Is there anything that you think's foreshadowing now as well with AI, what that might look like with involvement in political rhetoric or discourse? I know it's a bit of a big question, but I'm just curious if you've seen any trends at all.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic that I'm sure we could talk a lot about. And actually, we have to some extent in terms of talking about some of these alternative media, social media places where people are getting their news from. From a like data collection politics perspective, I think polling has moved from being kind of traditional telephone surveys to doing more things with, text to web and online surveys, which are kind of interesting because you can test visuals and images and you can test videos and do a lot more stuff that's interactive that you can't do on a phone survey. So I'd say like just myself in terms of as a researcher, in terms of data collection, I've done a lot more of that than I did when I first started in the industry. And when I was doing polling for Trudeau, we would test images of him in different situations to see what are the situations people respond to positively or negatively, which again, you can't do in a telephone survey. You can't be on the phone and say like, imagine Justin Trudeau standing at a podium versus imagine him giving a selfie with someone. So, I think that opens up some opportunities and more broadly, I think just again, social media opens up some opportunities around listening in on these conversations that are going on social media. It's kind of the new water cooler, right? And I've seen it done not that well in a lot of these sentiment analysis and social media scrapings. And if somebody could do that really well in terms of just sort of representing that conversation that's happening online, I think there's a lot of value that comes from that too.
Yeah, good points. And I think it goes back to our first part of this conversation about the interaction between Carney and Trump and the body language. Like those things, I think, make a factor of, like you said, not a simple black and white of yes, no, I felt like it went well, but a lot of other, I think, behind the scenes and factors at play. But as we're talking about data, I also want to point to how Pollara launched a new tool to track consumer spending patterns. And it's being called a permanent line of sight into how Canadians are feeling when it comes to spending, finances, cost of living, job security, and even politics. Can you break that down for us, what this tool actually does and why it's important maybe for businesses to have this kind of access to data? And on that note, too, like once they have that data, what's the end game? How should they be using it?
Yeah, like we've talked a lot about, I guess, how political parties use polling and research. This is more of a corporate tool, and businesses and organizations need data for the same reasons the politicians do, right? Because things are changing very rapidly, especially given tariffs. That's having a big impact on consumer habits and buy Canadian. And I think if you're an organization, just as political parties need to kind of keep up to date on what public opinion is saying and how it's moving. It's very helpful for a big company to have a sense of like, how is our reputation going up and down? How are consumer habits going up and down in this world where things are changing very quickly? We've put out this KeyCast product, which is basically giving companies who want to a monthly dashboard to say, how are Canadians' economic outlooks? How are their consumer habits, buying patterns in different sectors changing? In addition to measuring reputation for companies and some of their competitors. So you can get a bit of a monthly snapshot in terms of how things are moving, so that you're just not having any blind spots in terms of how things are changing. And obviously, if you see a big change, then you can do more research and figure out what's kind of driving it. But I think it's a good monitoring tool. Only $1,000 a month, and we'll throw in a ShamWow if you if you sign up now. That's my pitch. But ultimately, yeah, I think it's a good example of how businesses need to use data the same way political parties need to use data, because you're in both situations trying to figure out what people think and how they're responding to external pressures. And there's a lot of external pressures these days that are changing public opinion.
For sure. And I'm curious too. I don't know if this is an ethical question or philosophical, but like, what piece do you think data plays in today's economy? Because I feel like to an extent, it's almost a currency. Because if you can see the data, see how people are interacting, you could make more money off of it or push whatever message you're trying to do. I'm curious, like, do you think that this is going to be a continued trend? Because we look as well at like Meta. They're basically a data mill, Tesla, all these things. That's data they're capturing to improve their products or sell other products. So I'm curious, like, in the grand scheme of things, of where that plays into whether it's our economy or that consumer behavior piece.
Yeah, like it's the same reason like political parties benefit from knowing who are their target voters and what messages their target voters will respond to vote for them. And if you're selling French fries, it's good for you to know who wants to buy French fries and what about my French fries they like. They don't like what someone else's French fries. It's the exact same thing as politics. So having data that gives you insights into who your target universe is, be they consumers or voters or whatever, is a big value, because then you can make data-driven decisions and you can actually like custom tailor a message that is responsive to the needs of the people that you're trying to reach and not responsive to people who will never buy your product or never vote for you. So yeah, I think it's not that different in terms of like polling in the corporate space compared to the political space, and having data in the corporate space and like in the political space, it's a big advantage.
And one of my last questions here, I want to point to, in addition to all this great work you've done for political parties and as well data polling for Pollara, since September 2022, you've been teaching the elections campaign course at Carleton's political management program. And you cover everything from strategy and communications to public opinion research and GOTV, go out to vote. Are you seeing any trends or insights into how students are viewing the political landscape today?
Yeah, and this has been a really fun thing to do since leaving government, teaching the campaigns course with the MPM program, which is a great program. And a lot of people who've gone through that program have gone on to have very successful careers as chiefs of staff and in government or GR firms. I think there's one alumni who's actually a member of parliament right now. One of my students actually ran in Winnipeg Centre in the last federal election, actually came very close to getting elected. So it's a great program that gives a bit of that background for what politics is all about, and gives you a bit of that manual for politics, which is not really there in most situations. You kind of go into these jobs or these roles and you're just sort of figuring things out as they go along. So it's been fun. I think from my perspective, like we talked earlier in this conversation about young people getting their information from very different sources than older people. And I don't consider myself an old person yet, but I'm certainly not a 20-year-old in terms of being up to speed in terms of how they're viewing politics and processing politics. And I'm still working on campaigns. I did polling for the New Brunswick Liberals and the Saskatchewan NDP in the fall. And I personally find it really useful to kind of have that line of sight into how younger people are thinking and looking at politics. And from my perspective, it's a nice way to sort of stay in touch, though I'm always saddened that they don't get my Western references because it's now a show of 30 years ago that nobody has seen. But nevertheless, a great program, and I've really enjoyed teaching there in the last couple of years.
Oh, that's so great, and I'm glad to hear because I think it's really important. Like you said, it is a manual because once you get actually into behind the scenes of politics in the minister's offices, it's like the Wild West out there of learning on the job and learning all these processes, how your minister reacts, and all these like really fun things that you definitely learn on the job.
Yeah, I mean, like after the 2015 election, I went into the prime minister's office as a director in the prime minister's office. And even when I was on the job for like almost a year, people would be like, oh, the MC is so and so. I don't even know what an MC is or like what the process is for like how everything moves in government. Yeah, I think it's great to give people that grounding.
And it's great that you yourself as a professor or instructor get to bring that experience to the classroom because I think that's so critical of understanding that because there's only so much you can like read and absorb, but like once you're in it, you're in it. And government for sure is like a beast in itself of navigating and public servants and all those other pieces. So like really, really well said. And Dan, I just want to thank you so much for this really great conversation. Are there any other closing thoughts you want to share with the listeners?
Geez, I mean, we covered so much ground here today. Look, I'm just hoping the next 3 months in politics are not as wild as the last 3 months have been. But I think one thing that the last 3 months have taught us is something that I actually have always really brought up in the MPM course with students. There is that the ballot question is the thing that really drives elections at the end of the day. And we do a lot of exercises around this and talking about how you can kind of change ballot questions and how that changes people's thought processes. And I think a year ago, had there been a federal election, the ballot question would have been cost of living change, like things that would not have been beneficial for the Liberals, which is why the Conservatives were up 25 points, whatever it was in the polls. But the ballot question shifted to Trump this year, and we saw the results of that, right? And obviously other factors and Carney coming in and everything made a big difference too. But I think it's a good reminder that you need to understand what people are basing their vote on when they go to the ballot box. And if that overriding ballot question, that the overriding thing changes, that can really change the political landscape in very dramatic ways. So the last couple months have been a very good case study that I will talk about in the fall with my students, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even just to the most recent Liberal win in a riding in Quebec by winning just one vote, I think really goes to show just how tight this election was. And to your point, how fast politics moves when it comes to the issues, what voters are looking at. We can even look at Ontario with Doug Ford calling that snap election. The timing is so critical when it comes
Yeah.
political issues and striking while the iron's hot and seeing what people are going to come out for and what motivates them. So all really good points. We definitely did cover a big spectrum of things. So Dan, I want to thank you so much for your insights. That was Dan Arnold, Chief Strategy Officer at Pollara, and he was joining us on Let's Talk Politics. So thanks so much for tuning in. Dan, thanks so much for your insights. And please tune in to hear from my next special guest. We'll catch you there.